Welcome to the Futures Here special series hosted by Creative Brands. The Futures Here showcases leaders, thinkers, and trendsetters from the creative industry, namely advertising, media, communication, and branding. My name is KG Srinivas. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Creative Brands, a portal that covers the global creative industry and economy. Today we have with us Siddhartha Butalia, Chief Marketing Officer of AirAsia India, a joint venture between Tata Sons and AirAsia Investment. Siddhartha began his career in advertising at Ogilvy and JWT, working on campaigns that won top honors at Cannes and the Asia Pacific AdFest. He also managed multinational accounts like Unilever and Nestle. Later, as a Tata Administrative Services Officer, Siddhartha worked on the Tata Nano project, built the Ginger Hotel business model for metros, worked on the integration of Tata Global Beverages with the acquisition of Tetley, 8 O'Clock Coffee, and Himalayan Water, and developed the internationalization strategy for the Tata brand in the US, UK, China, and South Africa. Siddhartha has over a decade of senior leadership experience in Europe and Asia Pacific, launching and heading iconic brands, from being brand manager of Tetley in the UK to overseeing strategy and business development for 15 Asia Pacific countries at Tata Global Beverages. As marketing director of the Taj Group of Hotels, Siddhartha launched the Vivanta brand, which is now a Harvard Business School case study, led sales and marketing teams across APAC, Europe, and Africa, and contributed to the Tata Group's East European Union agenda. Siddhartha is a futurist and a speaker on travel and tourism, marketing strategy, and digital ecosystems at seminars across the world. Aptly, therefore, Siddhartha, welcome to the Futures Here, where we look to the future to be present today, here and now. Siddhartha, let's begin with AirAsia's latest campaign, Time to Travel. So you're signaling that, yes, it's time to fly yet again. How long did it take for you to prepare yourself to arrive here with a campaign?
Thank you, Srini, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today, discussing this campaign. It has taken us a while to come into fruition. The concept was always there. I think what we were struggling with is when is the right time to position the campaign. We had from the beginning of the first signals of the pandemic, and we had early signals from our other group, airline operating certificates or airlines in Southeast Asia, an inkling of the way in which things would come even before the pandemic hit in full force in India. And we had divided, therefore, our organization, marketing, and communication strategy into 3 phases. The first was what we anticipated and looked at as the phase of isolation, which was the initial period of the lockdown itself. And the consumer sentiment at that point of time was understandably fearful and anxious. We therefore decided that the theme for communication at this point of time should not be a sales or marketing pitch, but needed to be transparent, reassuring, and empathetic. It was a period of time when there was a fair degree of confusion and anger about people. There were many cancellations of plans that people had. There was an uncertainty related to travel. And so on that time, from a media consumption perspective, a lot of individuals, especially younger consumers, began to consume content in digital formats, being homebound. And so most of our communication moved to social media formats. We essentially killed all communication from a typical above-the-line, out-of-home, print, TV, etc. medium, and focused on digital and social media for that phase. We then moved into a phase of restricted travel, which was the early days post the lockdown, from the end of May towards the first few weeks of June and July. And this was a period where we thought the sentiment had moved to being cautious, but slightly optimistic. And in this period, obviously, travel norms were fairly stringent. We understood that corporates were cutting down costs, and there was a significantly reduced discretionary spending by travelers. So the ability to influence people to travel was not high on the agenda. At that point of time, the idea was, how do we service individuals who felt that they need to travel, and how do we service them in the best mode possible. And that included migrant labor, for example, who are returning uh, to their hometowns. And we had a number of initiatives during this period. And then we recognized in this period, and off the back of a travel intent survey that we conducted with our consumers, flyers from people who had flown pre-pandemic, during, and people who were looking forward to flying post, to really gauge that travel sentiment. And on the back of that is when we realized that there is an underpinning of an exploratory theme that seems to be coming and defining the new normal. There is a yearning for travel and exploration. There is a need for celebrating the freedom that we all took for granted before it was taken away. And that became the genesis of the campaign, and the idea that we should um, beckon people with this call of saying it is now the time to travel, with the take being that it is the time to travel back, in the sense that it is travel back to all the moments that you've missed in 2020. Don't lose the moments that have gone by in the year, but actually travel back in time and celebrate those moments. If you've missed your anniversary, if you've missed that trip where you were looking to find yourself, if you've missed the family, get together in the summer, etc., all of those. And that really became the genesis of the campaign.
Quickly, Siddhartha, have you had some feedback already? Have you had some bookings already for following the campaign or the recent weeks?
Yes, I think the timing of the campaign also coincided with the Diwali festive season coming in, and so the numbers were quite good. I think it's been a very successful period of time for travel in general and the aviation industry in India, with the kind of pickup that has been happening. It has been an organic growth that has happened, I think, from the beginning of when we have seen the country open up. Month on month, even by the numbers which have been reported by the DGCA, starting from the month of August into September and October, there has been roughly a 35 to 38% growth month on month in the numbers. Obviously, the passenger numbers, if you look at daily passengers in the period of October being flown across the country, is only 175,000 versus a pre-pandemic number of, say, about 425,000. So overall PAX numbers are down, obviously, compared to where it was earlier. And there is a slow recovery that we see happening across the board. But it picked up pace a lot, and especially for us when we look at our market share, when we look at the amount of interest that it generated from a flight search perspective, because of the amount of visits that we got to our website immediately after the campaign went in. And the campaign is honestly very much still live. So the first edition of the campaign with the anniversary creative was what we took out across all editions of print in the country, with the full page jacket, page 1 and page 2. And that did get a lot of interest for us in terms of visits, flight search, etc. And also translating obviously into bookings, both for the immediate term as well as interest in the long term. And we're seeing some of the impact of that even in terms of the bookings going forward. And I think that has been a trend that has helped not just us, but invigorate interest across the industry as well.
From an academic perspective, how does it compare with other airlines, comparable airlines within the country?
From a campaign
the recent spurt in numbers, the bookings and travel plans.
So the numbers that we get in the industry are typically the numbers that are reported by the DGCA, which are monthly figures that come across towards the end of towards the middle of the month is what they publish for the previous period. So the October numbers are what have been published so far. We haven't seen the November numbers published yet. We expect those to come in the next week or 10 days or so. So we don't have a realistic estimate of the post-pandemic numbers. Obviously, we have our own assumptions of how we're faring. And our indications are obviously that the market share has grown. We have seen our market share even from September to October increase from 6% to 7.1%. So from that perspective, things are looking quite good and optimistic for us. I think what has also happened in this period is because there is regulation of fares in the aviation industry. The typical price sensitive market, and it continues to be to a large extent a very price sensitive market, decisions are not being influenced by price because all the airlines effectively are selling on those routes at the same price due to the government legislation. And thanks to that, and that was also part of the impetus for us to initiate the campaign, with decisions not being driven by price, the other factors such as the product features, the service experience, and the affinity and salience of the brand itself begin to influence the purchase decision a lot more. And so we felt that that was the prime moment for us to actually enter and influence the decision of which brand to choose for those who are choosing to travel, as well as influencing people to travel, because what we also recognized is through the course of the survey that there is a great degree of not just optimism, but there's also a recognition among individuals that the measures that have been enforced by both airports and airlines significantly reduce the risk of transmission compared to many other activities that individuals seem to be doing in cities in any case. So when we looked at the risk, for example, that individuals associated with various different activities outside of visiting close friends or family or a local store, air travel actually scored a lot better than visiting a mall or eating out at restaurants or any other mode of transport by far. The other positive thing that we saw is that those individuals who had traveled post-pandemic, their scores on the safety and the perception of risk were a lot better than those who had not. So there is an apprehension of individuals who have not experienced travel. But for those who have experienced air travel, obviously the comfort levels are a lot higher. And as those numbers increase and the word of mouth increases, we anticipated that obviously that will be seen to increase. And when you look out in the metros, or if you look at the Google COVID mobility reports of how individuals are consuming or eating out at restaurants, going to supermarkets, etc., with those numbers rising, considering that it is in fact true that air travel is safer, and the general perception is also that air travel is safer, we saw no reason why people would not want to do that, considering that they also have a great yearning to get out and travel beyond the confines of their local community.
To step back a little, Siddhartha, in its latest report, WALK, World Advertising Research Center, says how global advertising spend is expected to fall by, say, 10%, a little over 10%, or $63 billion to about $557.3 billion this year, this calendar year, led by sharp cuts in investment in the automotive, retail, and travel and tourism sectors as a result of COVID. Now, what brands naturally would be careful under the circumstances. Now, what has been your strategy during this period in question, as well as, let us say, how do you look to the 2 quarters further up?
I think it's a general trend. There is an obvious change in macroeconomic drivers across the world, and there's no denying that. The travel and tourism industry has been one of the most significantly hit. I think the general consensus in the industry is now that it returned to pre-crisis travel spends, especially when you look at business travel, etc., is unlikely before 2023 or 2024, let alone the next year or so. I mean, those numbers vary depending on which side of the chicken counter you're standing on. But if you look at the ACI reports in 2019, for example, global passenger traffic, which is measured by the number of passengers accommodated by airports, grew from about 8.8 billion to 9.1 billion. For 2020, I think the latest estimates are as low as 5.6 billion. So there is a significant reduction. On the positive side, of course, disruption of a nature of this kind is defined by the creation of a new market and a value network. And that typically displaces established market-leading firms, products, alliances, etc. The good thing is that the transportation industry and aviation in particular is no stranger to disruption. It happens in every economic cycle that we have seen due to various different macroeconomic factors. And if there's anything, that's the basis of how aviation has got to where we are today. If you look at specific to the region that we're operating in the top 3 domestic aviation markets in the world, and it's predominantly domestic aviation that is driving business right now. Even in 2019 with the US, China, and India. And the IATA's latest forecast suggests that the annualized long-term domestic growth forecast, say over the next 15 or 20 years, is upwards of 7% for India and upwards of 5% for China, compared to say a 2% for the US. Now, as a comparison of the modes of transport which might shift individuals, if you look at rail networks in the US, railway networks in the US deliver about 500 million passenger trips a year, versus China, which does 3.5 billion, with a significantly high average stage length of about 500 plus kilometers. So equivalent to the kind of stage length that air travel would do. India does over 3.6 billion non-suburban trips. So the market which is there, even if you look at the market of rail travel that is there, to be able to move them from rail to air travel, and we have seen that shift happening as the rail networks have curtailed in India, is significant. So it's not just, I think, about trying to retain the flyers of yesteryear, but really about looking at how to expand the base and attract individuals who have been flying or who have not experienced flying. And we saw a number of those individuals come in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. From a strategic perspective, I think one of the things that the airline industry needs to do, and when it comes to advertising spends, is to move away from the commoditization that has happened over the course of many decades. Where if you look at, for example, the price of coffee, or how coffee has moved from being a commodity into an experience with the likes of Starbucks, etc., almost the reverse has happened with air travel, where it has moved from being an experience to almost becoming a commodity, which is why it is so influenced by price and not by brand. And I think now that individuals will be choosing based on their perception of not just safety, but service experience, product experience, efficiency, the brand, how we treat customers and take into consideration their needs and preferences. I think the need for communicating that to individuals, whether through branding, marketing, PR and communications, etc., will only increase, versus the lack of the ability to influence people through communications, because decisions were primarily driven by price earlier. I do think that is a trend which is here to stay and is a positive trend as far as the industry is concerned.
Do you see that changing globally, Siddhartha, this commoditization versus service quality and the experiential aspect? Do you think that will change globally? Because low cost was something that people took to.
Yes, and I think those lines have blurred in India, certainly, the lines between what a low-cost carrier and a full-service carrier is. It's happened not necessarily by design, but by various different factors which have influenced things. I think with the collapse of Jet Airways, a number of the aircraft then were acquired by other airlines which were low-cost carriers. And so you had airlines now which had acquired an aircraft which had a business class and an economy class, which they were then operating being a low-cost carrier. Or you had others, including the low-cost carriers like ourselves, who have a variety of meal options which are significantly greater than the meal options that a typical full-service carrier has. Or if you look at the national carrier, they actually reduced the number of meal options on the domestic network. If you look at the kind of services that airlines are offering, they've expanded beyond just the airline itself to a network of ancillary partners. We ourselves have partnered with Avis in this period. We've partnered with another very innovative organization called Carter Porter for a service called Fly Porter, which allows you to deliver, to get your bags picked up from your home and delivered to your address wherever you're going. We've implemented a lot of technological interventions, looking at biometric check-in, for example, in partnership with Bangalore Airport, looking at SMS bag tags, and various different things like that, which I think to a large extent have significantly blurred the lines between what is typically seen as a full service or a low-cost carrier. And a low-cost carrier is actually defined not by the services that they're offering, but the model in which they operate, which allows you to drive efficiencies. So for example, we have only one aircraft type, and that drives efficiencies in being able to operate, being able to plan the network, being able to service the aircraft itself. And that allows you to drive prices down, but also allows you to give more of an experience for the same price. And that, I think, is what will continue to stay. From the perspective of whether these trends are going to be global or not, I do think that it's almost a necessity. If brands, and this is not just true of aviation, don't differentiate themselves, then there's a limit to how long they will continue. And I mean, this goes back to over maybe 20 years. I think in the 1998 issue of the Harvard Business Review was when Joseph Pine and James Gilmore had come up with the term of the experience economy and positioned experiences as the next category of economic value. And that really has stayed. The tenets of that are not changing in any form. Each of us are defined by our experiences. I mean, our experiences reshape our identities, and travel is perhaps one of the most inspiring experiences. I mean, for some people, it's about creating memories, developing a sense of community. For others, it's about gaining a deeper understanding of the world around them. But that accumulation of experiences or accumulation of memories is one of the most powerful forms, I think, of conspicuous consumption today. It's not the accumulation of goods. We see the transition in all developed economies, including China, moving from the consumption of goods to the consumption of memories, because that's what ultimately defines us. So if you're able to create experiences that are memorable for individuals, that's what I think will create economic value in the long term, and the world needs to move in that direction.
So let us step a little inward and look at how you manage the AirAsia story, both internally and externally during this period. You ran several initiatives such as Humans of AirAsia. On the business side, you ran customer happiness calls. Now tell us how you managed both the internal as well as external environments.
So I think it went back to the phases I'd originally spoken about, and in each phase, looking at what the consumers were going through and going to our own values. I mean, being guest obsessed is one of the AirAsia values, but being one AirAsia and people first is the other pillar that makes the brand what it is. And we obviously recognize that it is the employees, especially in a service industry, that are able to deliver and interact with the experience. So when we started off with the communication theme of saying, if people are feeling fearful and anxious, then we need to be transparent, reassuring, and empathetic. That translated into concepts like Humans of AirAsia, which you referred to, which was based on the same premise as Humans of New York or Humans of Bombay, which is really to celebrate our own all-stars, our own employees, who had during the pandemic gone out of their way, gone the extra mile, to do something for the communities in which they operate. And that is obviously one of the founding tenets of the Tata Group itself. So it resonates well with the values that the employees espouse in general. And it's something that we typically don't celebrate in the same manner, because it is part of the ethos of who we are. But we took it upon ourselves to say, let's take these stories out because they can be inspiring. And let's take these stories out onto social media. Let's take these stories out and encourage our guests and our followers to be inspired by those stories and to lend a helping hand to other individuals. We did it ourselves by reaching out, for example, in communications with other airlines typically considered competition, because we realized that they're all going through the same thing. So we had a campaign which was called In This Together, which was not just about the communities and who we were operating with, and where we were actually encouraging people to stay at home rather than go out, which was contrary to what airlines typically do during the lockdown. We then moved into a concept of what we call flights of imagination, which was crowdsourcing stories of individuals who were feeling trapped inside their homes and asking them to metaphorically imagine what flying feels like to them. And we rewarded those with the most compelling stories or the most compelling forms, and people came in with forms of dance, with forms of various different expressions of fireworks and things like that, with a holiday which we awarded to them in partnership with the Taj Group, to say that those with the most compelling stories of flights of imagination would actually get a holiday at the Taj Exotica in Goa in partnership with AirAsia, with a couple. And those, I think, became the founding sort of themes or the stories at that point in time. We then moved into, when restricted travel started, a campaign of now everyone can fly again, but also with building that sense of community and trustworthiness and engagement, recognizing that we were not flying to full capacity and had the ability to support individuals like migrant labor, where we tied up with individuals, associations, non-government associations, communities like the National Law School alumni, who were sponsoring flights for migrant labor moving out from places as far-flung as Port Blair, but from metro cities like Bombay, Calcutta, etc., to other locations like Bhubaneswar, Ranchi, including with the governments, for example, the government of Odisha, to get these migrant labor who were not able to get back because trains were not operating, they did not have money, they did not have any forms of income or employment, and had not thought of air travel, have never considered air travel. But being how reasonably priced we were able to make things at that point of time, given that we had the extra capacity and the support of these individuals, was just about gathering individuals who would be able to fill a flight and get them back to their homes. And that kind of thing, I think, really inspired the employees themselves to be able to serve individuals who were in need, and it galvanized them and enthused them about what they were doing, which is very different from the standard service that they're doing. And it also, I think, brought air travel and brought the brand closer to many people who had not considered or experienced that before. So it was quite inspiring for us, I think, at that point of time, to be able to use our network to do that. We did two other activities of a similar nature. In May, we launched a Red Pass, which was free flights for doctors and the medical community, to say that when you're done fighting the pandemic, when you need a break, as all individuals do, we announced 50,000 free seats on our flights for doctors. We did the same thing on the 15th of August for members of the armed forces, dependents, and retired personnel for the armed forces, to invite them all to fly AirAsia, because we recognize that we do have capacity, and why not show a gesture of appreciation to all the heroes in our minds who were doing so much for communities across the country.
At the same time, how did you keep employees engaged within, and how did you manage to keep the morale high under the circumstances and their commitment to the airline?
I think we're fortunate that we have an employee base that is very enthusiastic and very passionate about the brand and the culture. We were able to initiate thanks to the fact that we had seen inklings, as I said, of the pandemic and how long it would take from our sister companies in Southeast Asia to, as a global organization, implement very quickly business continuity plans, much before many other organizations did. Being a younger organization, both with respect to the way in which we think, as well as the average age of the employees and of the organization itself, and being very technologically driven, we were able to quickly adapt into a tech-driven network. So immediately, things moved on to, even during the lockdown, onto Zoom calls and onto infrastructures like this. What we also recognized is that people who are used to being in an operational environment, on the shop floor, at the airports, ground operations, cabin crew, etc., needed to feel engaged. And we recognize that there will be a change in the way in which travel will move in the long term. And so we quickly moved into reskilling many of the employees. What we also realized that there was an influx of calls, for instance, coming into our contact centers or our social media handles for individuals who did not have their flights anymore because flights were canceled for 2 months across the country, or who had various different reasons why they needed to travel or support that they required, including people coming from outside or moving across various states. And we managed to reskill quickly, and using very simple resources like your laptops and phones, etc., actually divert many of these phone calls coming from into customer support channels. For these individuals who are customer facing in any case, as well as many of the senior management of the organization also, to start engaging with customers and responding to their queries directly. And that kept the individuals, one, in touch with the customers, which I think is paramount to the service industry. Rather than losing touch with them, it also kept them abreast of the challenges that individuals are facing and what their expectations are and what their emotions are at this point of time and how to deal with them. But we did a significant amount of training, reskilling, upskilling, etc., across the board, and opened up many opportunities for internal job postings for individuals to move from one part of the organization to another and get cross exposure in this period. So a lot of educational interventions from a learning and development perspective, and a lot of engagement, which we were able to deploy with daily calls happening across the board with these individuals, really helped to keep the spirits up, I think.
So at no point you really experienced employee redundancy. I think as a lot of organizations experienced, you never really felt that employees or at least some number was redundant.
No, I think we recognized, and this was a conscious call taken not just by us but by the larger Tata Group, that this time, and this is something that I think is not just in this instance, but in all throughout the history of the group, I think in times of trouble, the recognition is that is not the time to part ways of what are essentially your most valued resources. That is the time, if anything, to live up to the spirit of what we were calling in this together. So we took a conscious call to say that, yes, I mean, in the short term, obviously there is a financial impact. And we did not, there were no redundancies at our end. There were no delays of salaries or payments that happened with the employees. And I think that also helped to a large extent with the morale, because they were able to see their friends, families, colleagues who were working in other places and how things were impacted there, and recognize that the organization is standing by them, because in essence, the organization is them. So we recognize to say that the organization is not distinct from the employees, it is the employees themselves.
Right. So it's in fact, it's a difficult time, and it's the crisis has many dimensions. One of them being the psychological dimension of the crisis, of the situation, of the economy in which we operate. As a communicator, what was at the heart of your strategy, both internally and externally as well, in conveying a sense of resilience? Not only conveying it, but also believing in it. That yes, we are here for the long run, the long haul.
I think we were, there were various different aspects to this, quite honestly. I think we recognize that this is going to be a time of change, that this is a time of disruption, and that those who start planning for the long term are going to be the ones who will essentially emerge the strongest from the crisis. So we really looked at the crisis as an opportunity. I think what also happened in this period is that just towards the beginning of the pandemic, the brand finance airlines ranking came out, and very clearly AirAsia came out on top of the Asian and ASEAN rankings in 2020. We were listed as the second most valuable airline brand in the ASEAN region, the strongest among low-cost carriers. We had the highest brand value growth in Asia and the second highest in terms of absolute value. And in fact, among these, the top 10, the sixth highest value growth in the world, and only among 4 Asian brands to have a brand value growth across the brands in the world. And that was derived from the fact that the consistency of the brand experience, the brand building efforts that we had done, the communication that we had maintained with customers and other stakeholders. And we actively reached out during this period to not just our customers, but also to our partners in the travel agent community, with the airports that we engage with our suppliers, with our agencies, etc. And it was heartwarming to see the response that we got from them, because we recognized that it is something that, while we took for granted, was not happening across the board. I think many organizations were not engaging in the same way with their partner ecosystem. What we did, for example, on the 29th of July, which was fairly early days into the pandemic, which was J.R.D. Tata's birthday, is that we sent out a letter, called up our top customers and travel partners, inquired about them, their health and their families, who they were living with at home, and took their meal preferences so that we could send on J.R.D.'s birthday what we called a taste of their travels back to their home, because we were not operating in the air. while airline food is notionally seen as something that is not very appetizing, we're quite proud of our own menu. We have a section called the Pioneer's Picks, which is based on J.R.E. Tata's favorite dishes. There's a filet of fish, basa with mashed potatoes, and there's a cheddar cheese omelette with a beetroot cutlet. We've innovated with a master chef, a young master chef Kirti Portika from Kolkata, a very innovative vegan moily curry. So we took those in a partnership with Swiggy to people's houses to say that this is a taste of your travels, which we're bringing home to you in case you're missing your flight experience. And those kind of engagements and the kind of response that we got from these individuals, I think that kept us going to a large extent, and support of these travel partners in this period, because a lot of the communication, for example, or bookings come through travel partners. And the primary point of contact that customers have with us is during the journey itself. But from the time that they book or they engage with, might be a local agent in a small town close to where they're living, or the contact center of a large online travel agency. But with each of those, these are individual relationships which are at the heart of this. And the confidence that we gave to our travel partners, I think, translated into the confidence that they gave to their customers about booking us and traveling with us. And that, I think, also helped shore up business in the long term as a positive impact of all of this.
Right. So that's one last question. In view of the current campaign that you're running, and I do recall you mentioning how this is more of a category building campaign rather than a brand building campaign. And as at this point of time, it will take time for the next, say, at least a couple of years for things to really bounce back, especially in the aviation industry. What is your forecast? What do you see through your crystal ball, say, the coming 2 years or 3 years, in the short term, up to, say, 5 years, the future of the aviation industry?
So I have particular premises that I fall back upon when I'm trying to look upon the future. And there is one that was, I think, coined by a science fiction author, William Gibson, which was this epitaph that said the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And this comes from the genre of cyberpunk, right? Which says there's a combination of low life and high tech, advanced technologies, artificial intelligence, cybernetics, etc., which is juxtaposed at the same time with a degree of breakdown or radical change in the social order, as typically happens when there is macroeconomic disruption. And I do see that would be the premise going forward as well. And that then, it's been coined, I think, also by the chief economist of Google. And I studied microeconomics myself, and his books, Hallvarian, where he said a simple way to forecast the future is to look at what rich people have today. Middle income people will have something equivalent in 10 years, and poor people will have it in an additional decade. I think the manner in which that need is met, however, is not necessarily fulfilled by a product or service with the same specifications. So to take an example, rich people traditionally don't wait in line. They have personal assistants who ensure that the car is waiting at their curb, or the maitre d' who escorts them to their table, or staff to open their doors. The digital rich have Google Assistant. So in the same way as we are partnering with the likes of an Avis, which is a chauffeur-driven vehicle essentially, but it's available on demand with the gig economy. Instead of chauffeurs, individuals now have Uber or self-driving cars or omniscient apps that monitor, inform, and nudge us in real time. So I think the ability to use digital platforms and digitization, take advantage of technology to serve individuals with what their aspirations were, or what they traditionally saw as only being available to those who could consume luxury. I think that is very much the future, because that continues to be aspirational for individuals. There is a corollary to the variant rule that I have, which is that it's also not just yesterday's luxury that is tomorrow's normality. It is also, in some senses, yesterday's normality that is today's luxury. It's a hearkening for the past. In this whole world of digitization, which is very binary by nature, it kind of takes away the human element of things. And so it's brands that will be able to bring back that human touch, the service experience, that will survive the longest. It's this hearkening for the analog, the shared experience. We've seen it with various different industries, like take watches, for example. I mean, with mobile phones, etc., it's a surprise that individuals still wear watches. And there is a trend of actually individuals wearing watches that no longer tell the time, because the watch is about really the memory of when they got that watch and who gave it to them. It's like the Patek Philippe campaign, right? It's something that you pass on through generations. We've seen the resurgence of various different industries, like the LP player, records, which have seen record growth literally over the last 10 or 15 years, including from younger consumers, or the advent of speakeasies, which had died down in the prohibition area. All of those coming back. So if we really look to differentiate going forward, then we don't need to look very far. I think we need to look back to the heyday of aviation and understand how aviation enabled experiences and memories, and the spirit of exploration, the spirit of pioneering that was always there, even when in India, G.R. Tata, the pioneer of Indian civil aviation, started off with his first inaugural flight. I think if we look back to those days and see ourselves as pioneers, see ourselves as enablers of new experiences, of connecting people, of connecting communities, that I think really is where the future will lie, and where brands should be able to differentiate themselves and actually build a connect with the consumers, which I think has been missing to some degree with the commoditization that has transpired.
Siddhartha, in fact, this just triggered another thought and allowed me to make this the last question of our interview. Do you see a civilizational schism, given the current crisis? A schism in terms of how people and brands interact, people's view of brands and how brands view people?
I hope not. I hope that we're able to bridge that gap. I think that there are inherent issues with digitization. I think there are inherent issues with the way in which digitization tends to lend itself to something, as I said, which is very binary, which is really about looking at individuals as data points. And we've all become very good at that, especially as marketers, of understanding what might drive individuals to purchase. But that does not really impact your affinity for a brand. And I think if you begin to focus on process efficiency rather than being people-centric, then you tend to widen that schism. And I think you, obviously that also is happening in any case, with income inequality increasing, with every economic crisis that happens of this nature. It tends to widen many of those gaps. And I think it is incumbent upon the human spirit to be able to persevere and bridge those gaps. And as communicators, it is important that we're able to use the modes that we have, including the advertising messaging or the communication messaging, to bring back to people's minds what is important, to not be scared of communicating and celebrating the different things that we think we should, of celebrating, for instance, diversity of experiences of individuals. What happens with, for example, business travel going forward, as an example, is we do see that as we have all moved on to Zoom calls, and we have all moved on, including many of the aviation seminars that I've been participating in are not happening in real time. It's travel and tourism individuals who are now interacting with technology. So technology will replace a large part of that. I think what will happen is corporate travel, for example, as organizations try to cut down costs, they will cut down corporate travel. But there is still a need for individuals to connect with other people, to have experiences. And that, I think, is what really will bridge that gap. And if we're able to inspire people to connect with each other, to connect across communities, to connect across spaces, to experience a shared experience, because I think we've all essentially been living in a very solo kind of experience with a small group of family within ourselves. And that tends to increase the psychological gap with individuals. It tends to alienate individuals and that also is binary in itself. You tend to think of yourself as an individual rather than part of a community. And it is only travel and experiences that I think will help build that sense of community back again. So I think it is up to us as individuals and as communicators to bridge that gap.
Thank you, Siddhartha. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.